Hello, this is Dr. Lungerhausen, and for History 123, and I have a lecture titled Openings about the European opening of Japan, China, and Korea to trade, uh, diplomacy, and ultimately colonization. This is part of Module 2 on the European century in East Asia from 1840 to 1940. You can download a version of this timeline from D2L. There's a black and white black and white version of the timeline document that I'm going to talk about next. And it roughly covers the time period from about 1840 to 1911, right up to just World War I. So download your own copy of the PowerPoint, or I'm sorry, your own copy of the timeline, and you can make notes and annotations on it as I do the lecture. Okay, so the timeline I have for you today has about 10 events on it, and they're all key moments in the history of European and then later Japanese imperial expansion in East Asia. So we'll start off with the big ones in China, and each of these represents a sort of moment where each of these represents a moment where uh, the the Chinese or Japanese or Korean governments are forced to interact with the Western powers. And the terms of their relationship are sort of set in this century, in this part of the 19th century, rather. All right. So the first key event is the Opium War between Great Britain and Qing, which begins in 1839 and ends in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing, which you've read about in Miller. Here we have an engraving showing the British steamship Nemesis destroying several Chinese warships during the fighting. And one of the highlights from the point of view of European writers and artists, like the ones who made this engraving, is the technological superiority of the European military, especially in this case the British Navy. But one point that Miller makes, and that you want to go back and read about, is not only was there a technological superiority at stake, but also an organizational superiority that might have even been more significant than simply having steamships or certain types of cannon. The next event we want to consider in the opening of China is the Taiping Rebellion. Now, normally most historians would consider this an internal problem, an internal crisis of the Qing dynasty, and indeed it was one of several uprisings in the 19th century that created problems for the Qing court and the Confucian scholar officials who managed China's government and state affairs. You can see here, though, from the map that the area that the Taiping government controlled, or at least claimed to control, was quite vast during the course of the war. And also, the war itself was quite bloody. It claimed the lives of tens of millions of people and was on a scale of, or even possibly a greater scale than the American Civil War, which we're all much more familiar with, and which took place roughly around the same time period. The Taiping Rebellion is important in terms of imperialism because it represents this moment where the Qing court has to make a choice about whether and how and whether they're going to reform the Qing state, and their options are to go somewhat in the direction that Japan would with the Meiji Restoration, which was a complete overhaul and, in a sense, dismantling an imperial system and building a Chinese nation state, or turning to self-strengthening, which is what they choose to do during the Taiping Rebellion. And as a result, power and authority devolves from the capital in Beijing onto the shoulders of individual governors who are responsible for putting down the rebellions in their province. And so self-strengthening is kind of a Confucian default. Right? That is, they say they instead of challenging the Confucian system or changing it in substantial ways, it's a sort of they fall back on what they know best. The next key event is, of course, Commodore Perry's mission to Japan between 1853 and 1854. And there are two visits that Perry makes. One is in 1853, where he goes with a small force and says he'll be back to discuss trade and diplomatic relations. And the second one, he shows up in 1854 with a much larger force, one that's more imposing. And this really marks the end of the Tokugawa seclusion policy, and the Japanese state is forced to open diplomatic negotiations first with the U.S., but then later Great Britain, France, Russia, and other countries. And as a result, Japanese society is thrown into chaos, not just because of the imposition of foreign relations by Commodore Perry and others, but also because the Tokugawa system had kind of reached a turning point where things needed to change, because Japan was no longer the same country it had been in the 17th century. And the Perry mission is kind of the catalyst for these changes, which will ultimately result in the Meiji Restoration. In Korea, we see the emergence of the Tonghak movement as a response to similar Western attempts to open trade with the Korean court. The Korean court in the Chosun dynasty, the Yi dynasty in the Chosun state, reject Western advances and demands for recognition and trade, and become more isolationist. There's also an intellectual movement, this Tonghak movement, which tries to revitalize Neo-Confucian thought one more time. Eventually, it will develop into a proto-nationalist movement, and it'll help catalyze a peasant rebellion later on in the 19th century. In 1867, you have the Meiji Restoration, where the Tokugawa shogunate is officially overthrown, and it's replaced by something that slowly develops into what we could call a sort of form of we could call it something resembling a constitutional monarchy, but in reality, the Meiji emperor was a figurehead for a group of oligarchs, basically former daimyo and their retainers, who tried to shift Japan into the direction of becoming a more modern nation state. And you read extensively about this in the Miller book. In 1871 to 1873, Iwakura Tomomi, led a group of Japanese officials, including prominent Meiji oligarchs Kido, Ito, and Okubo, along with 50 students, to go examine the development of constitutions and industrial economies in the Western world. They also wanted to place these 50 students in universities around the world so that they could study, earn Western degrees, and come back to Japan to continue the modernization under the Meiji regime. In 1876, Japan was strong enough, 10 years after the Meiji Restoration, to impose a new treaty on their neighbor Korea, the Treaty of Kanghwa, and they forced the Koreans to open themselves up to trade on the same unequal terms that Perry had forced Japan to open up to trade. This treaty would mark the beginning of a long-term Japanese involvement in Korean affairs, and ultimately it's one step on the road to Korea becoming a Japanese colony. Another step is the Tonghak Uprising, which began in January 1894, and this was a popular uprising in Korea where Tonghak reformers at the head of peasant armies tried to force the Yi dynasty into reforming the regime and defending Korea against Japanese and Western European imperial encroachment. This uprising precipitated a international crisis because the Korean court first called on the Chinese to help send troops to put down the Tonghak uprising, which provoked a Japanese response, and they also sent troops to support another faction at the court who was more pro-Japanese and wanted to move Korea away from the Chinese orbit. The result was from August 1894 to April 1895, the Sino-Japanese War, which was fought mainly in Manchuria, Shandong province, and in, of course, Korea. The end result is that the Japanese defeated China and replaced them as the sort of East Asian regional power. Another key moment in imperial history in East Asia is the Boxer Rebellion in China. Again, this is an internal rebellion led by a sort of heterodox sect of mystics and sort of people inspired by Chinese folk religion. And what happens is that at first the Boxers rise up and try and overthrow the Qing dynasty, in part because they're angry with the Qing for allowing Western incursions into China, but also because of a localized crisis, a flood, and then a drought, which basically wrecked the livelihoods of thousands and thousands of farmers and peasants. And so the peasants tried to drive out the Qing. Later, the Qing turned the Boxers against the Western powers and tried to drive them out of China. The result was that the UK, France, the United States, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, as well as Japan and Russia, sent soldiers to suppress the Boxer Rebellion and to punish the Qing court. The Qing court ended up fleeing Beijing, but there was a terrific and bloody showdown between the Boxers and these Western armies. It's important to note that the Japanese and the Russian armies provided the largest numbers of soldiers, although every country sent a contingent. And so this was another test case for the Japanese to try out their army and to flex their own imperial muscles. The next to last incident we'll mention is the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. It's mainly fought in Manchuria and Korea. There are several significant naval engagements, namely a battle for the Straits of Tsushima, as well as a couple of sieges. But the main significance of the Russo-Japanese War is for the first time a European power is defeated by a non-Western power. The Japanese are able to fight the Russian army to a standstill. In fact, Russia has a significant revolution in 1905, in part because of its defeats in the Russo-Japanese War, and this forces the Russian government to the bargaining table, and Japan is able to gain significant concessions and becomes a kind of equal player in the imperial annexation of China. And Japan is recognized now as a rising power in its own terms. The deal also basically the treaty also seals the deal in terms of Japanese influence in Korea. Now, after the Russo-Japanese War, Japanese influence over Korea will be total, and in fact, in 1910, Korea will be annexed, or would be annexed by Japan directly as part of their empire and ruled by a Japanese governor-general, without even the fig leaf of the Yi court to cover up Japanese control.